The late-night bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of 5th and Main, its hydraulic doors hissing open like a tired siren. Drummed against the windows, turning the city lights into watercolor, smears across the glass. Most passengers barely glanced up from their phones or dozed fitfully against the vinyl seats as the new arrivals climbed aboard. Sarah Martinez stepped up the metal steps, her worn combat boots making no sound on the rubber matting. At 34, she moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that drawing attention could mean the difference between life and death. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and a thin scar ran from her left temple to her chica. Souvenir from Kandahar that she'd stopped trying to hide with makeup years ago. Behind her, a German shepherd with graying fur around his muzzle padded up the steps. His canine vest had seen better days, the patches faded, and the Velcro worn smooth from countless missions, but his dark eyes were as sharp as ever, sweeping the bus interior with professional intensity. Move along, the bus driver muttered, without looking up from his clipboard. He was tired, probably on his second shift, and wanted nothing more than to finish his route and go home. Fed coins into the fare box and guided Rook down the narrow aisle. The bus was sparsely populated. Few night shift workers heading home, a teenager with earbuds blasting music loud enough for everyone to hear, an elderly woman clutching a purse to her chest. Sarah chose a seat halfway back near the emergency exit. Old Havasis. The bus lurched into motion. She settled into the worn seat, and Rook positioned himself in the aisle beside her, his body a living barrier between Sarah and the rest of the world. She rested her hand on his head, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. 3 years since they'd both been discharged. 3 years since the explosion that had ended their military careers and left them both scarred her visibly. Him in ways that only showed in the nightmares that still woke them both. The army had wanted to retire Rook to civilian life, but Sarah had fought the paperwork battle of her life to keep him. He was her partner, her anchor, the only one who truly understood what they'd been through together. Now, they rode city buses instead of military transports, lived in a one-bedroom apartment instead of barracks, and survived on her disability check and the occasional odd job the world had moved on from. Their war, and somehow they'd become invisible in the transition. But Rook's training never switched off. His ears twitched, swiveling toward the back of the bus, like satellite dishes honing in on a signal. Sarah felt his body tense beside her, the subtle shift from relaxed companion to alert working dog. She followed his gaze to the rear seats, where a man sat hunched against the window, a thick blanket pulled up to his chin. Another passenger. Boy, she whispered, but even as she said it, she felt her own instincts stirring. Something about the man's posture, the way he held his shoulders, seemed wrong, too rigid for someone who was actually asleep. The bus hit a pothole, jarring everyone awake, except for the man in the back who didn't move an inch. Sarah frowned. In her experience, real sleepers adjusted their position, constantly shifting to find comfort on the hard seats. This man sat like a statue. Rook's head lowered slightly, and she heard the faintest rumble deep in his chest. Quite a growl yet, but a warning that only she could detect. Her hand moved instinctively to the small of her back, where she'd once carried a sidearm. Now there was only empty space, and the phantom weight of weapons she no longer had the right to bear. Their bus rounded a corner, and the man's blanket slipped slightly. Sarah caught a glimpse of his profile in the passing streetlight's angular face, short-cropped hair, the kind of rigid posture that screamed military training. But something was off about his appearance, like a picture that had been subtly altered. Rook, she murmured, but her own pulse was quickening. Her partner's instincts had saved their unit more times than she could count. He'd detected IEDs before the sweeps found them, sensed ambushes minutes before they materialized, and once dragged her unconscious body away from a burning Humvee while shrapnel whistled overhead. Rook was concerned she should be too. The bus swayed as it took another turn, and Sarah studied their fellow passengers more carefully. The teenager was lost in his music, head bobbing to a beat only he could hear. The elderly woman had dozed off, her purse now slack in her lap. A construction worker in paint-stained coveralls stared out the window, probably calculating how many hours until his next shift. All of them looked normal. All of them except the man in the back, who sat too still and breathed too carefully. Lyric shifted beside her, and she felt him coil like a spring. Whatever had caught his attention was escalating, moving from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. Sarah's combat training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat. Identify escape routes. Protect your partner. The bus driver was oblivious, humming along to classic rock playing softly through the speakers. The other passengers remained in their own bubbles of exhaustion and distraction. Only Sarah and Rook seemed aware that something was building in the back of the bus, something that made the hair on her arms stand up and her heart rate climb. She'd learned to trust that feeling in the desert. It had kept her alive when logic and training weren't enough. And now, as the bus rumbled through the sleeping city and rain pelted the windows, that same sixth sense was screaming at her to pay attention. The man in the back shifted slightly, and Sarah caught another glimpse of his boots beneath the blanket. Military issue, but the wrong branch. The sole was too thick, the leather to new details that most people would never notice, but Sarah had spent years learning to read the subtle signs that separated friend from forux. growl became audible now, a low vibration that seemed to resonate through the metal floor of the bus. One or two passengers glanced over, but seeing only a woman with her service dog, they quickly looked away. Sarah was used to being dismissed, overlooked, forgotten. Tonight, that invisibility might be an advantage. The bus slowed for the next stop, and Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Was she being paranoid? 3 years of civilian life had taught her that not every suspicious person was an enemy. Combatant, not every unexpected sound was incoming fire, but Rook didn't make mistakes. His instincts were honed by training and sharpened by experiences. The bus doors opened and a couple of late-night commuters climbed aboard. Sarah made her decision. She would trust her partner's judgment, just as she had in the desert. Whatever was happening in the back of the bus, they would face it together. The doors closed with a pneumatic hiss, and the bus pulled back into traffic. In the back, the man remained motionless beneath his blanket, but Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. Rook's body pressed against her leg, solid and reassuring, ready for whatever came. Next, the city scrolled past the window, street after street of sleeping buildings and empty sidewalks. But inside the bus, in the space between the humming engine and the whispered conversations, something was about to break. Sarah kept her eyes forward and her hand on Rook's head, but every nerve in her body was screaming that their quiet bus ride was about to become something much more dangerous. Rhythmic rumble of the bus engine became a time machine carrying Sarah back to dusty roads and armored convoys. She closed her eyes and could almost smell the desert cordite and diesel fuel, fear, sweat, and determination beside her. Rook's steady breathing was the same metronome that had counted off the seconds between safety and disaster. In another world, another life, shed been Sergeant Martinez, then leader of a K-9 search and rescue unit attached to the 82nd Airborne. Rook had been younger, his coat darker, his body lean and powerful from constant training and deployment rotations. Together they'd saved 43 lives, a number she'd never been able to forget because each one represented someone's father, mother, son, or daughter who got to go home. The bus hit another pothole, and Sarah's hand instinctively tightened on Rook's head. He responded with a soft whine, the same sound he'd made during those long nights in the desert when mortar fell like deadly rain and they'd huddled together in whatever shelter they could find. No boy, she whispered, I feel it too. The last mission played in her mind like a damaged film, real, skipping and jumping between moments of crystal clarity and gaps of merciful darkness. They'd been searching a compound outside Kandahar, looking for 3 missing soldiers from another unit. Intelligence had suggested the building was empty, abandoned weeks earlier by insurgents who'd moved deeper into the mountains. But Rook had gone rigid at the threshold, his body language screaming danger in a way that needed no translation. Sarah had called for backup, but the radio crackled with static and urgent reports from other firefights across the valley. They were on their own. Next made the decision to go in anyway. 3 soldiers were missing, possibly wounded, definitely running out of time. That's what leaders did. They weighed impossible choices and lived with the consequences. The compound had been a maze of connected rooms and narrow corridors, each corner a potential ambush point. But Rook had guided her through it with the confidence of a dog who could read danger in the very air. They'd found the first soldier in a storage room, unconscious, but alive, dehydrated, and with a bullet wound in his shoulder that had been crudely bandaged. The second soldier was in worse shape, delirious with fever, his leg obviously broken. But he was breathing, and when he saw Sarah and Rook, he'd managed a weak smile. Knew someone would come, he'd whispered it. Was while they were administering first aid that Rook had suddenly gone berserk, barking with the kind of primal urgency that meant immediate mortal danger. Sarah had looked up to see the third soldier, wounded, not captured, but standing in the doorway, with an AK-247 in his hands and madness in his eyes. He'd been turned somehow, captured and broken, and convinced to betray his own unit. The intelligence had been a trap, and they'd walked right into it. The explosion had come from the room behind him, a remote detonator, probably triggered by someone watching from a safe distance. The world had turned white-hot and then black, and Sarah's next clear memory was of Rook dragging her through rubble by her vest, his teeth locked onto the heavy fabric as debris rained down around them. She'd woken up 3 days later in a field hospital, her face stitched back together, and her left arm in a cast. Rook had been in the kennel beside her bed, his right hind leg wrapped in bandages, and his eyes filled with the same hollow exhaustion she felt in her bones. The other soldiers hadn't made it out. The compound had collapsed completely, burying the traitor along with his victims. Sarah and Rook had saved 43 lives during their deployment, but they couldn't save the 3 that mattered most. At the end, the bus lurched to a stop at a red light, jerking Sarah back to the present. Her cheek throbbed where the scar tissue tightened when she was stressed, and she realized she'd been clenching her jaw beside her. Rook was fully alert now, his body practically vibrating with tension. The man in the back hadn't moved, but something about his stillness had changed. It was the difference between someone who was asleep and someone who was pretending to be asleep while listening to every sound, cataloging every movement, waiting for the right moment to Sarah had seen that kind of predatory patience before in the desert and in the mountains of Afghanistan. It was the stillness of a hunter who knew his prey was close, who was waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. "What do you smell, boy?" she whispered, barely moving her lips. Rook's nostrils flared, and she saw his hackles rise slightly beneath his vest. Whatever he was detecting went beyond simple suspicion. This was recognition, the kind of scent memory that came from encountering genuine danger. The light turned green, and the bus moved forward, but Sarah's mind was racing through possibilities: military posture, wrong boots, artificial stillness, and now, Rook's increasingly agitated behavior. Each piece by itself meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern that set off every alarm bell in her trained consciousness. She thought about the news reports she'd seen over the past few weeks. Something about a manhunt, a fugitive who'd escaped federal custody during a transport. The details had blurred together in her memory. Just another story about someone else's war, someone else's failure. But now she wished she'd paid closer attention. The bus passed under a streetlight, and for just a moment the illumination caught the man's face and profile. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face not personally, but from somewhere important, a briefing maybe, or a security alert. The features were sharper than she remembered, and there was something different about his hair, but the bone structure was unmistakable. Rook shifted beside her, and she realized he'd gone completely still, in the way that preceded explosive action. His body was coiled like a spring, under compression, ready to launch himself at whatever threat he'd identified. She'd seen him make that transition countless times in the field, from companion to weapon, in the space of a heartbeat. Easy. She breathed her hand, finding the thick fur at the base of his neck. Not yet, but even as she tried to calm him, Sarah's own adrenaline was spiking. Her peripheral vision sharpened, her hearing became acute, and she found herself automatically cataloging the positions of every person on the bus. The elderly woman 3 rows up, the teenager with the headphones, the construction worker near the front, potential civilians who could become casualties if things went wrong. The bus rounded another corner, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the man's hands beneath the blanket. They were positioned wrong for someone who was sleeping, too ready to tense, and on his wrist, barely visible in the dim light, was the pale line of a recent tan mark where a watch or restraint had been her. Combat medic training kicked in automatically, reading the signs like symptoms of a disease, stress indicators, deception markers, the micro-tensions of someone maintaining a false identity under pressure. She'd learned to recognize these patterns in field hospitals where wounded enemies sometimes tried to blend in with the patients they'd been trying to kill minutes earlier. Growl became audible again, and this time it carried a note of genuine aggression. Sarah had heard that sound exactly once before. In the compound seconds before the world exploded around them, it was the sound Rook made when he detected not just danger, but betrayal. Someone who was wearing the wrong skin, carrying the wrong scent, pretending to be something they fundamentally were not. The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, probably wondering about the dog, but his attention was quickly pulled back to the road by the demands of late-night traffic. The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their own small worlds of exhaustion and routine only. Sarah and Rook understood that they were sharing their small mobile space with the Redditor, who was counting on their ignorance, their assumption that a sleeping passenger was exactly what he appeared to be. Man in the back shifted slightly, and Sarah saw him check his watch, a quick furtive movement that confirmed her suspicions. He was tracking time, waiting for something, a prearranged pickup maybe, or simply the right stop where he could disappear into the urban maya. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She had no weapon, no radio, no backup, just her training, her instincts, and a battle-scarred German shepherd, whose loyalty had never wavered, even when everything else in their world had fallen apart. The bus rumbled through the night, carrying its cargo of sleeping commuters and hidden dangers toward whatever confrontation was building in the space between suspicion and certainty. Sarah kept her breathing steady and her hand on Rook's head, but she could feel the familiar cold fire of combat awareness flowing through her veins. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, just like always. The next stop was announced in the driver's tired monotone. Elm Street and Broadway. Sarah felt Rook's muscles bunch beneath her hand as the bus slowed hydraulic brakes, sighing in the darkness through the rain's windows. She could see the empty intersection, a handful of closed shops, a flickering streetlight, shadows that could hide anything or anyone. As the bus lurched to a stop, Sarah watched the man in the back seat through her peripheral vision. He remained motionless, but she caught the subtle shift of his shoulders, the way his head turned just a fraction toward the doors. He was listening, calculating, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. No one got off, no one got on. The doors hissed shut, and the bus pulled away from the curb. But Sarah felt the tension ratchet up another notch. Whatever the man had been expecting at that stop, it hadn't materialized. Plan A had just failed. Beside her, Rook rose to his feet in one fluid motion, his body blocking the narrow aisle like a living barricade. His tail was rigid, his ears forward, and the growl building in his chest carried undertones that made Sarah's skin crawl. She'd heard him make similar sounds when they'd encountered insurgents wearing captured American uniforms trying to infiltrate forward operating bases with suicide vests and automatic weapons. Rook, she whispered, but he ignored her completely. His attention was locked on the back of the bus with laser intensity, his entire being focused on a threat that only he could fully quantified. A teenager with the headphones finally looked up, pulling one earbud out. As he noticed the large dog standing in the aisle, "Hey lady, your dog okay?" he called out, voice carrying the careless concern of youth. Several other passengers turned to look, and Sarah felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. The elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. The construction worker shifted in his seat, probably wondering if he should do something. Even the bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, frowning at the disruption to his routine. But the man in the back remained perfectly still. "He's fine," Sarah called back, trying to project calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. Just a little restless. She tugged gently on Rook's harness, but he might as well have been carved from stone. His training had taken over completely now, overriding everything except the imperative to protect his handler from the danger he'd identified. Sarah had seen him in this state before, in the moments before mortar attacks and roadside bombs, when his enhanced senses detected threats that wouldn't become apparent to humans for several more minutes. The bus rounded another corner, and the motion caused the man's blanket to slip again. This time Sarah got a clear look at his boots. Not just wrong branch, but wrong country. The stitching pattern, the leather quality, even the lace holes were subtly different from American military-issue foreign manufacture, possibly Eastern European. Her breath caught as more pieces fell into place. The escape she'd half remembered from the news had involved a prisoner transport, someone being extradited for war crimes. An international case which would explain the foreign boots and the full disguise. Rook took a step forward, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that he was preparing to act. His body language had shifted from alert to aggressive, the stance he'd taken in the compound just before launching himself at the traitor who'd betrayed his own unity. "Boy," she whispered, but her own pulse was racing now. If Rook was right, if the man in the back really was the fugitive from the news, then they were sharing a confined space with someone desperate enough to kill anyone who threatened his freedom. The bus hit a pothole, jarring everyone awake, except for their suspicious passenger. Sarah watched him carefully and saw what she'd missed before. His breathing was too controlled, too measured. Real sleepers breathed irregularly, shifting and adjusting constantly. This man breathed like someone maintaining a conscious performance. She thought about the other passengers, innocent people who had no idea they might be sitting next to a killer. The teenager was young, probably someone's son, heading home from a late job or a friend's house. The elderly woman reminded Sarah of her own grandmother, who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident. The construction worker had paint under his fingernails and exhaustion in his shoulders. Someone who worked with his hands to support his family. Of them were potential casualties if this went wrong. Rook suddenly barked a sharp, commanding sound that echoed through the bus like a gunshot. The other passengers jerked awake, startled and confused. The bus driver's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror, his face creasing with annoyance. "Lady, you need to control your animal," or he never finished the sentence. The man in the back moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd trained for exactly this moment. The blanket fell away to reveal not a sleepy commuter, but a predator in human form, lean, scarred, and radiating the kind of focused violence that Sarah recognized from her worst nightmares. His hand went to his coat, moving toward something concealed beneath the fabric. Sarah caught a glimpse of metal, the distinctive shape of a weapon that didn't belong on a city bus full of innocent people. "DOWN." The command tore from her throat with the authority of someone who'd led soldiers in combat, who'd made life-and-death decisions. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Rook exploded into motion like a missile launched from a silo. 90 pounds of trained German Shepherd hurtled down the aisle with the precision of a smart bomb, his trajectory calculated to intercept the threat before it could fully materialize. The elderly woman screamed. The teenager dove over his seat. The construction worker shouted something incoherent as the bus erupted into chaos, but Sarah's attention was locked on the unfolding confrontation. At the back of the bus, where her partner, her brother-in-arms, her fellow survivor of war, was doing what he'd been trained to do since he was a puppy. He was protecting the innocent from those who would harm them no matter the cost. To him, man's weapon cleared his coat just as Rook reached him, jaws snapping toward the hand that held it. Sarah was already moving her own training, overriding 3 years of civilian conditioning. She might not have her rifle or her sidearm, but she had something more valuable, a partner who'd never let her down, and the skills to back him up when everything went to hell. The bus swerved as the driver fought to maintain control, while his vehicle became a battlefield through the windows. Sarah could see blue and red lights in the distance. Someone had called the police, or maybe they'd been following the fugitive all along. Either way, it was about to be over, but first they had to survive the next 60 seconds. Time slowed to the crystalline clarity Sarah remembered from combat. Each second stretched into a dozen heartbeats, every detail burned into her consciousness with perfect fidelity. Rooks leaped through the air, muscles bunching and extending with predatory grace. The fugitive's face, no longer hidden behind the mask of sleep, twisted with surprise and rage. The weapon in his hand, a compact pistol that caught the bus's fluorescent lighting like a malevolent star. Sarah was moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct. 3 years of civilian life peeled away like old paint, revealing the soldier underneath, the woman who'd led search and rescue missions through hostile territory. who'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between bringing everyone home or writing letters to grieving families. The bus lurched violently as the driver hit the brakes, throwing passengers forward in their seats. But Sarah had anticipated the motion, had planted her feet, and adjusted her center of gravity, the way she'd learned in the back of bouncing military transports under enemy fire. She used the momentum to launch herself down the aisle, toward the confrontation unfolding in the rear of the bus. Rook's jaws clamped down on the fugitive's wrist. Just as the man's finger found the trigger, the gun discharged with a deafening crack that seemed to suck all other sound from the confined space. The bullet went wide, shattering a window and letting in a sudden rush of cold night air and rained. The elderly woman's scream cut through the ringing in Sarah's ears. Behind her she heard the teenagers sobbing and the construction workers shouting for the driver to call 911. But her focus was laser-locked on the life-and-death struggle playing out in the back seat. The fugitive was stronger than his slight build suggested, muscles corded with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. He drove his left fist into Rook's ribs, trying to break the dog's grip on his gun hand, but Rook had been trained by the best handlers in the military, had learned his craft in the crucible of war, where hesitation meant death. He adjusted his bite, his teeth finding the pressure points that would maximize pain and minimize the fugitive's ability to use the weapon. His body weight pinned the man against the bus window, and his growl had become a continuous rumble of barely controlled aggression. Sarah reached them just as the fugitive managed to shift the pistol toward Rook's head. Without hesitation, she grabbed the man's wrist and slammed it against the metal window frame. Once, twice, 3 times, until his fingers spasmed, and the gun clattered to the floor. Federal fugitive, she shouted over the chaos, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in crisis situations. Everyone stay down. The fugitive's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition flicker across his features. Not personal recognition, they'd never met, but the acknowledgement of one predator identifying another. He knew she wasn't just some civilian with a service dog. He could see the combat experience in her stance, the professional competence in the way she'd disarmed him. You don't know what you're doing, he snarled, his accent confirming Sarah's suspicions about his foreign origins. You don't know who I am. No, you're not supposed to be here, Sarah replied, maintaining her grip on his wrist, while Rook kept him pinned. I know you escaped federal custody, and you've been running for 3 weeks. His eyes widened slightly. The news reports were coming back to her now, details she'd dismissed as someone else's problem flooding back with perfect clarity. Dmitry Volkov, former military contractor accused of war crimes in 3 different conflicts. He'd been captured in Mexico and was being transported for trial when the prison bus had been ambushed outside Phoenix. 2 federal marshals had died in that attack, and Volkov had disappeared into the American underground. Until tonight the bus finally screeched to a complete stop, the driver pulling over in front of a 24-hour diner, whose neon sign cast everything in shades of red and blue through the shattered window. Sarah could hear sirens approaching, multiple units, close and getting closer. Sarah Martinez, Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired, she said, partly for the fugitive's benefit but mostly for the 911 dispatcher, who was undoubtedly recording everything through someone's cell phone. I have a federal fugitive in custody assisted by a trained military working dog. We need immediate federal backup and medical assistance. Avova's face contorted with rage and something that might have been fear. You think you've won something? You think this ends here? He tried to twist free, but Rook's grip tightened and Sarah pressed her advantage, using a joint lock she'd learned in military police training. It ends with you going back to prison, she replied. It ends with those marshals getting justice. The first police car arrived with a squeal of brakes and a wash of red and blue light that painted the inside of the bus like a crime scene photograph. Through the windows, Sarah could see officers deploying, establishing a perimeter, treating this as the high-priority situation it had become. But Volkov wasn't finished. With the desperate strength of a man who knew his freedom was measured in seconds, he made one final play. His right hand, the one not pinned by Rook, went to his ankle, where Sarah suddenly realized he'd hidden a backup. Whippin' Rook out, she commanded, simultaneously pushing her partner away from the immediate danger zone. The German shepherd released his grip and backed away, but his eyes never left the fugitive's face. Volkov's hand came up with a small knife, its blade catching the emergency lighting as he lunged toward Sarah's throat. But she'd fought hand-to-hand combat in places where losing meant more than just personal defeat. It meant her squad didn't make it home. She caught his wrist, redirected the blade's trajectory, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the seat in front of him. The knife clattered away into the darkness as Volkov went limp, consciousness fleeing in the face of the concussion that came from connecting skull to metal at high velocity. Sarah sat back on her heels, breathing hard as the first officers boarded the bus with weapons drawn and tactical lights blazing. Rook moved to her side, pressing his warm bulk against her leg in the gesture of comfort and solidarity she remembered from a dozen firefights in the desert. A federal fugitive subdued and unconscious, she called out to the approaching officers, her hands visible and empty. service dog and handler. No injuries to civilians as the professionals took over. The scene checking on passengers, reading Volkov his rights to an unconscious man. Sarah allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. 3 years of feeling invisible, of being forgotten by a country that had moved on from there. Warren, suddenly she and Rook were relevant again, but more than that, they'd done what they'd always done best. They'd protected the innocent, served something larger than themselves, and proven that some bonds forged in combat could never be broken by time or trauma or the indifference of civilian life. "Good boy," she whispered to Rook, scratching behind his ears as federal agents arrived to take custody of their prisoner. "Still got it, don't we, partner?" His tail wagged once, the first time she'd seen him truly happy in months. The sun was rising over the police station when Sarah finally emerged from the debriefing room, Rook padding beside her with the satisfied exhaustion of a job well done. Federal agents had spent hours going over every detail of the confrontation, confirming what their own investigation had already suggested. Dmitry Volkov had been planning to rendezvous with accomplices who would smuggle him out of the country instead. He was back in federal custody, facing additional charges for the death of a federal martial assault with a deadly weapon and resisting arrest. His 3 weeks of freedom had ended because a retired German shepherd had recognized something wrong in his scent, his posture, his breathing. Rebecca Chen, the lead federal investigator, walked Sarah to the exit. She was young, probably fresh from Quantico, with the eager competence of someone who still believed the system worked more often than it failed. "The reward money will be processed within the week," Chen said, handing Sarah a business card, $50,000 for information leading to Volkov's capture. In this case, capture itself. Sarah looked at the card, then at Rook, who was watching a squirrel with professional interest. $50,000 was more money than she'd seen since her discharge. Enough to cover rent and medical bills for both of them, enough to buy Rook the joint medication that would ease the arthritis that came from too many hard landings in the desert. "There's something else," Chen continued. "The Bureau is always looking for qualified personnel. Your military record, your canine experience, what you did tonight. We could use someone like you." Offer hung in the air, like a lifeline thrown to someone who'd been drowning so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe easily. A new career, a return to purpose, a chance to be relevant again in a world that had forgotten their service. But as Sarah looked down at Rook, she saw the gray around his muzzle, the careful way he distributed his weight to favor his injured leg. He'd given everything for his country, had earned his retirement a dozen times over. He deserved to spend his remaining years chasing squirrels and sleeping in sunny patches, not dodging bullets and chasing fugitives. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, "but I think we're done." "But the hero business," Chen nodded, understanding more than her words conveyed. "Well, if you change your mind, you know how to reach me outside." The morning air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the night's rain. News vans were pulling up to the station, reporters spilling out with cameras and microphones, eager to capture the story of the female veteran and her canine partner who'd brought down a federal fugitive. For a moment, Sarah considered walking around to the back exit, avoiding the attention that would inevitably fade within a news cycle or two. But then she looked at Rook, who was sitting at perfect attention beside her, his canine vest catching the morning light. He deserved better than being forgotten. Against Argent Martinez, the first reporter reached them, a young woman with perfect makeup and imperfect understanding. "Can you tell us what happened on the bus last night?" Sarah looked into the camera and saw not her own reflection, but the faces of every veteran who'd come home to silence and indifference. Every service dog who'd been retired to obscurity after years of saving lives. "My partner detected a threat," she said simply. "He did his job. Same job he's been doing for 8 years, same job thousands of other military working dogs do every day. The only difference is that tonight people noticed." "What's your dog's name?" Another reporter called out. "Rook," Sarah replied, and she saw his ears perk up at the sound of his name. "Military working dog, retired 3 tours, 43 lives saved. Last night." Makes 44th. Cameras clicked and whirred, capturing the moment for the evening news and tomorrow's headlines. But Sarah's attention was on Rook, who had begun to wag his tail at the sound of all the attention. For the first time in years, people were looking at him, not with pity or dismissal, but with the respect and recognition he'd always deserved. "Is it true you tackled an armed fugitive?" The question came from a veteran reporter, someone old enough to understand the weight of what had happened. Rook identified the threat, Sarah corrected. Everything else was just backup. More questions followed, but Sarah kept her answers short and focused on the real hero of the story. She talked about military working dogs, about the thousands of them who served in silence and retired in obscurity. She mentioned the veteran support organizations that helped both human and canine soldiers transition to civilian life. She made sure that anyone watching would understand that what happened on the bus wasn't an isolated incident. It was what happened when you gave retired heroes a chance to serve Aganas. The crowd of reporters finally began to disperse. Agent Chen approached one more time. She knelt down and offered her hand to Rook, who sniffed it politely before allowing her to scratch behind his ears. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "the Bureau has a canine unit. We're always looking for experienced Trainers, people who understand the bond between handler and dog. It wouldn't be fieldwork, more like consulting, helping train the next generations. I considered this watching Rook lean into the agent's touch. He was still a working dog at heart, still wanted to feel useful and valued. Maybe there was a middle ground between the intensity of military service and the isolation of complete retirement. Send me the details, she said finally. We'll think about it as. They walked away from the police station. Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen in months. People were looking at them with recognition and respect. Instead of pity or dismissal, a construction worker tipped his hard hat as they passed a mother with two small children. Pointed to Rook and whispered something about heroes to her kids. The bus stop, where their adventure had begun, was just a few blocks away, marked now with police tape and the lingering evidence of the night's drama. Sarah paused there, remembering how invisible she'd felt just 12 hours earlier, how forgotten and irrelevant their war had seemed. You know what, boy, she said, scratching Rook's head as he sat beside her in perfect military posture. Maybe we're not quite ready to be completely retired after all. His tail wagged once, and Sarah could swear she saw something in his eyes that had been missing for too long. Purpose, pride, and the quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. The city bus pulled up to the stop, its doors hissing open. With the same pneumatic sigh that had started their journey, the driver was different this time. A middle-aged woman who looked at Rook's vest and smiled. Service. Dog rides free, she said, as Sarah reached for her fare. Thank you for your service, both of you. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Sarah settled into a seat near the front, Rook beside her in the aisle. This time, other passengers nodded respectfully as they boarded. A teenager offered to give up his seat. An elderly man asked if he could pet Rook, then spent 10 minutes talking about his son who'd served in Iraq. The invisible woman and her forgotten dog had become visible again. Their story, a reminder that heroism didn't retire just because the headlines moved on to other wars, other crises, other forgotten veterans who deserved better than society's indifference. Through the bus window, Sarah watched the city wake up to a new day somewhere in a federal holding cell. Dmitry Volkov was discovering that freedom was more fragile than he'd imagined. Somewhere else, two families were getting closure for the marshals who died trying to keep a killer behind bars. On a city bus rolling through the morning light, a female veteran and her canine partner were learning that some bonds forged in combat were strong enough to bridge any gap between service and civilian life, between recognition and obscurity, between the heroes we remember and the ones we forget. Rook's head rested against Sarah's leg as the bus carried them home, is breathing steady and content. For the first time in 3 years, they both knew exactly who they were and why they mattered. They were soldiers, they were partners, they were heroes, and they always had been, even when the world had forgotten. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom full of new FBI recruits. Rook, sitting at attention beside her. On the wall behind them hung a commendation from the director of the FBI, recognizing their service in the capture of a federal fugitive and their ongoing contribution to the Bureau's K-9 training program. The most important thing to remember, Sarah told her students, is that your dog isn't just a tool or a weapon. He's your partner, your brother in arms, your early warning system for threats you can't even imagine yet. If you take care of him, trust his instincts, and never forget that you're a team, he'll save your life more times than you can count. In the front row, a young agent raised her hand. What's the most important command for a K-9 handler to master? Sarah smiled, remembering a rainy night on a city bus when everything had changed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Listen, she said simply. When your partner tells you something's wrong, you listen. Even if you can't see the threat, even if everyone else thinks you're being paranoid, even if it doesn't make sense. You listen, and you trust, and you act. She looked down at Rook, who was watching the students with the patient wisdom of a dog who'd seen more than his share of dangerous humans and lived to tell about it. Because sometimes, Sarah continued, the most important battles are won by heroes that nobody notices in places where nobody's looking, by partners who never forget that their job isn't to be famous, it's to keep the innocent safe and bring the guilty to justice. Class dismissed. The students filed out with new understanding of the bond between handler and dog, but Sarah and Rook remained looking out the window at the city where they'd found their purpose again. They were visible, now valued and respected for the skills they'd never lost and the service they'd never truly finished. The invisible woman and her forgotten dog had become teachers, mentors, living proof that some stories don't end with retirement. Sometimes they just find new chapters, and, on quiet evenings when the city settled into sleep, they still rode the buses together, watching and waiting, ready to answer the call if danger ever showed its face again, because that's what heroes do. They serve, they protect, and they never truly retire from the mission of keeping the world a little bit safer for everyone else, even when nobody's watching, especially then.